Iditarod Trail. For those of you that don't know me, it's really, I think there's assumptions that get made. Alaska had a lot of gifts for me. It showed me that beyond any place I've ever been, that you cannot judge a book by its cover. It's one of those places where someone walks in and I realize that I judge everybody when they walk in. And it's something I'm trying to get better at because I realize I'm never right. And this lady walks in to this bar, restaurant that wasn't far from my cabin in the woods. And she looks like she probably has a grandkid or two, and just a lady who's finished 10 Iditarods behind a sled dog team of 16, 1,000 miles. A lady that knows toughness and challenges that I would just be like, I'm out. No. And I think it's so easy many times when we're in these environments to think that the person that might be sitting up here has just always been that way. And it's a miracle that I'm here. And I'm only sharing these things with you so it eliminates the opportunity for you to say, I can't get there. It's too late. I'm starting too late. I don't have this. I don't have that. At 22 years old, I was in jail. So many bad decisions, 2 drunk drivings, that my freedom was taken from me. I was just a shell. I mean, my mom would say she loved me through the whole thing, but I still call BS on her. And my biggest adventure was just stepping out of that jail and just saying, that's it. I don't know where I'm going, but I don't like this. But at that time, I couldn't have run to that door without losing my breath. You know, there was no adventure. There was just a commitment to just say, you know what, I'm going to take one step away from this guy and try to find that guy, whoever that guy is. And so that was the start. And then it was, a 5K, and it was, dying in 33 minutes and swearing I'd never do it again. And, that led to a 10K, which led to a 10-miler, which led to me seeing crazy people in Colorado doing crazy things. And for whatever reason, there was a seed in me, and that was the water that made that seed grow, and we were off to the races. But don't make any mistakes. I'm not the fastest guy out there. I think fast, slow, big, tall, skinny. Comparison is just a bunch of baloney, And this race showed it in spades. There was no, when did you finish? Everybody, all the competitors, the question was always, did you finish? Did you get there? And I think that's all that matters, I would argue that someone that finishes in third place and gave 80% of themselves didn't win versus the person that finished in last place but gave 100% of themselves. That's the winner. That's the person that got every ounce out of their being. And Alaska, this race showed it to me, and I share that with you just so that you know that I'm sitting only taller because I'm on a taller chair. I'm right here we're all part of the same tribe. We're all part of the same group. There's no up here, down there. It's all here supporting each other. The Iditarod Trail Invitational doesn't let just anybody in. I love that. They also don't have a gear list. I love that. You have to do qualifying races to get into the Iditarod Trail. There's a few of them. The Arrowhead 135, which takes place in the ice box of the North, International Falls. Temperatures sometimes going down to 40 below. This year, it got to 33 below. There's one in Wisconsin called the Tuscobia Trail Ultra. It's 80 miles out and back. If any of you have been on the Cumming Trail where it's nice and straight, the Tuscobia Trail is that way 80 miles. Think about that being your view out the window for 10 hours out and back. Mind-numbing. But you have to do all of these races because Alaska is an incredibly unforgiving place, and you make mistakes there, it can kill you. No one's died there yet, but there were a couple stories this year where they were on the doorstep. And that's the reason they don't have a gear list, because when you show up there, they figure when it's your toes and your fingers and your nose that are at stake, you'll bring the stuff that protects it. Survival's a pretty strong instinct. So that's what I've been up to since I made fun of fat bikes 5 years ago, and somebody at Rasmussen on Thanksgiving Day after 4 inches of new snow said, "Take this thing out for a spin." And I had my checkbook out by the time I got back. Laying tracks, first tracks in the snow, headed down to the Cumming Tap, and I was just in love. And now the cold places have my heart. There's no place that I've ever been that is more honest. I still do not know if Alaska and this race are the most caring, loving, hard love parent that just bends for no one, even if it means you lose toes, but it says, this is how it's gonna be, and we're not changing for anybody, and if you don't do it the way it's supposed to be done, well, you can come back and try again, but I'm not changing. Or it's the most heartless place that loves nothing more than to just try and break people. I think it's this one. I think it's that place that says, there are treasures that I offer, and if you want them, you're gonna have to prove to me how bad you want them. Yeah, that's it. I'm going with that. That's what it is. So they load us up. You go into a hotel the day before the race in Anchorage, Alaska. Everybody know what the Iditarod Trail is? I don't want to make any assumptions. It's a 1,000-mile trail that goes from Anchorage to Nome. And it was originally established for inter-village traffic as well. And so, you know, if we want to have a cup of coffee, back in the day, I got to saddle up my sled dogs and come 30 miles down the trail so we can have coffee. There weren't snow machines, there weren't snowmobiles, or I had to hike or I had to ski it. As gold was discovered in Nome and things like that, snowmobiles, those kind of things, but basically it was just a necessity. How you could get from one place to the other. And like all things, eventually, I guess, a couple crazy people in a bar said, "I bet you can't. I'll show you." And so now it's become a race. Everybody knows, most everybody knows the Iditarod sled dog race. That's the famous thing. And in Alaska, it is the Super Bowl. I promise you, more people are watching the Iditarod in Alaska than are watching the Super Bowl. There's people, most people in Alaska, they don't even know who played in the Super Bowl. And there's a decent amount that don't even know there is a thing called the Super Bowl. But not long after the dog-powered race then became a human-powered race. You can bike it, you can ski it, and you can run/walk it. And as I mentioned to you before, as a rookie, they'll only let you do the 350. And I love that too. You can't buy your way in. It's not Everest, no offense to Everest, but if you got enough money, I mean, somebody will pull your ass to the top of that mountain. And a lot of times to the demise of other people that have done their work that are also on that mountain. So the beauty about checking into that hotel room and in that place, if you've seen The Highlander, which is a great old movie, but not everybody knows it, but if you do, you know the reference, it's The Gathering. I've never been so humbled and so excited to be surrounded by 72 nut jobs. It's just amazing. And at the same time, like some of the people I shared with you earlier and the things that they have done, it shows me how limited I get in my own beliefs of what I think I'm possible, what I think I'm capable of, because there's people there that are doing and have done this trail numerous times, the 1,000 miles, and guys that have, fallen through the water and had to, light fires and get themselves warm in a matter of 10 minutes, or they're going to die, and they're back to do it again. And I'm like, you're crazy, but you're my kind of crazy. And so there's that, and as a rookie, whatever your thing is, imagine being able, if you're a baseball fan, imagine that you get to go suit up and you get to go to the All-Star game and you get to go out that tunnel and you get to play ball with the best. That's what I got to do. I got to go be a part around the people that were the best on the planet at moving forward in a really wild and crazy, sometimes seemingly angry, directly at you kind of place. Like it has it out for you. There's times you believe that. And so there was that part of it, which was just amazing, to just sit in that room and pinch yourself, to think, how am I here? And I hope you all get to experience that sort of moment where you've followed your dreams to a point where you actually kind of have that same thing where you wake up in the middle of the night and you're like, was that dream real? Because that seemed really real. Like I was in it. I think it was that kind of thing. And they start to explain, the race course, and I had done a lot of homework. This place scared the hell out of me. I moved there November 25th. Moved into a cabin 6 miles outside of Fairbanks, no running water. I went out every morning to get logs to stoke the fire, and that's how I kept myself warm. I'd go out on training rides when it was 20, 30 below, as inhospitable as it could be, come back as tired as I could be, and lay out my camp and get into my sleeping bag and make mistakes to where I'd have to be like, that didn't work so good. I'm going inside where the fire's warm. I'll come back and I'll try that again. Because I knew that on the trail, when you whip out your sleeping bag and you do those things, you're not doing it because it's a picnic. You're not doing it just because, you're doing it because you're behind the 8 ball. You're doing it because you have to. And in those kind of temperatures, you get yourself so cratered that you literally at times have gone so far beyond your limit that you stop and you have to talk yourself through, how do I unbuckle my helmet? Fortunately, I spent a lot of time in my 20s drinking way too much, and it was a similar kind of experience. So I guess that wasn't all a complete loss. But it's that kind of thing. Not only does the bike stop working so well when it's 40 below, but your brain and the blood flowing through it kind of turns to sludge. And so that was my experience. I was in the woods, I was in a cabin. The only noise I would hear would be, on occasion, there was a mama moose that would put me on her route. And she would walk up my driveway, and I'd be on cloud nine all day long because I just thought, I just had a moose walk up my driveway. How cool is that? And then keep going. But this was my one thing, and I was willing to put my whole life on hold. And not even to say on hold, it just became my life. And when you chase that one thing, the universe will rally behind you. And the fact that you don't know where it's going to lead, that's what you have to give for your one thing. You have to give faith. You have to be willing to take the steps and trust that the universe has your back. And it always does. It's 100%. Know that. Because there's going to be times chasing your one thing that you're not going to have it all figured out. You can't have it all figured out at the start. You have to trust that some of these things are going to work out. And they will. And it's really cool to see them work out. They loaded us into a bus the next morning. You load all of your bikes in. They give you a nice rah-rah speech, but at the same time, they tell you about this and the kind of things, not to scare you, but to make you prepared. And you get in that bus and you head hour and a half outside of town to a bar that the people that have done the race before brag about the cheeseburgers. And so you're not going to get many more opportunities for cheeseburgers. So everybody hangs around and eats a lot of cheeseburgers just before that race. And then you line up at the start line and you take your picture that you saw there in front of the Iditarod banner, and off they sent us. And you settle in. You don't know how long you're going to be there. I promised myself that I would live by Forrest Gump's rules. I would eat when I felt like eating. I would sleep when I felt like sleeping. And when I had to go, I'd go. And those were going to be the things that ruled. I wasn't going to race. I was going to go to the absolute best of my ability, but I wasn't going to chase. I felt like I was in the shape to do it, but this place pokes you. And it never stops poking you. It says, how's your fitness? And you say, I'm good. And it says, how's your systems? Meaning, do you know how to get in your sleeping bag when you're really cratered? Are you willing to stop? Are you willing to boil water? Are you willing to do this? Do you know how to do this? Do you know how to ventilate so you don't sweat, so that when it gets cold that you freeze? And you say, I'm good. And it says, well, what about your ego? What if I tell you that you can't go up that mountain? Will your ego say, yes, you can? Will you take the bait? And I go, I don't know. I got a pretty big ego. And it goes, all right, I found your weakness. And then it starts to dig. And it's always looking for that. And if it finds it, it will use it to break you. Because it says, what I'm offering, the rewards I'm going to give you, you're going to have to do everything right. And there were so many things I was so excited for. The first one was to get just into the race, just to get going. The jitters, the 3 months of being in a cabin, of doing everything, of hoping you can do this, the wondering if you're going to let everybody back home down. I mean, there's just all of these things. Are you up to it? And so it was great to get started. And the first 10 miles, 20 miles are pretty nondescript, but you're in the race. You're underway. And for those of you that have done any events, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you that have launched a new business, you know what I'm talking about. It's so good to finally be in the game, right? You're doing it now. You're not planning anymore. You're into it. And our first big challenge was 15, 20 miles in. We dumped into a place called Flathorn Lake, and immediately you were just in this giant lake covered in white mashed potatoes. It was freaking horrible. You couldn't move. You'd fall over, and it was the first test, because the thing to do is to let air out of your tires, and to keep letting air out of your tires until you stop falling down. And you would be amazed, even at that first test, how many people failed. Not failed in the fact that they quit, but failed in the fact that they couldn't convince themselves to take 5 seconds to get off their bike and let the air out of their tires, because they wanted to keep up with the person in front of them or that person over there. So they just keep trying to do that. Well, I just kept letting air out of my tires till I could ride my bike. And eventually, I was riding my bike 2.5 miles an hour. But you were falling over. Or you were walking your bike 1.5 miles an hour. And I wasn't there to beat you, but I tell you, I was really proud that I was doing my work. I'd followed my systems, and I was doing what was necessary. And when I crossed that lake, which was probably 5 miles to get across and took me 2.5 hours, I was pumping up my tires on the other side because the trail was better, with a big smile on my face. Because it's one of the lessons that Alaska teaches you that you can take into everyday life. You do your work. You don't skip. You don't try to shortcut it. And if you do, it's just not going to work. You might still get there, but you're going to get there frustrated. You're going to get there more taxed. And I was on my way, and another 10, 15 miles I got to ride on my first frozen river, Squentin River. And that just seemed like a really big deal. I'd never ridden my bike on a frozen river that just went forever. And the sun was set by this time, although the sun was coming back quite a bit. At one point, there was 3 hours of sun in Alaska. That was my shortest day while I was there. Now it was up to almost 9. And vitamin D is a real thing, trust me. It's pretty sweet. And so it started to snow and you're on the lake. And by that time, even though there were 70 of us that had started, the race was starting to thin out. And by that point, you might not see any red lights ahead of you, and you might not see any headlights behind you. And so it's a pretty awesome thing to be where nobody other than those people that are following your blue dot on the other side of that tracker that's on your handlebar knows where you are. And there's a little bit of a security blanket because you do know there's racers behind you and racers in front of you, but you're very much on that river and you're on your own. And at 1 o'clock in the morning, we started at 2 in the afternoon. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I pulled into the Squentna Roadhouse. And it's a roadhouse. It's a bar with some rooms you can stay in. And it's just a place for people that are traveling the trail to be able to get some soup and get in out of the cold and get a room if you want to, and which I did, and I was happy to do. I thought, this is great. I got 13 hours of biking under my belt, and it's 1 in the morning. I'll get 3 hours of sleep, and I'll be back on my way at 5 o'clock in the morning. That was kind of my game plan, is to keep it at about 3 hours sleep. I had a good friend that I'd mentioned earlier that had done REM, and we had some talks about how sleep works, and it was really helpful. And I'd practice that too, how I would wake up after 3 hours and without coffee. God, that sucked. And so, you know, it was so exciting to pull in there and have those first 50, 60 miles out of the way and to be into it, and a storm was raging behind us that never quite caught me, and there were people that lost the trail. It blew shut on them, that it took them 3 hours to cover the last 5 miles into that roadhouse. They couldn't ride. They couldn't see. They just were walking their bikes. Luckily, I stayed just ahead of it. And at 5 o'clock in the morning, you get up and chug a Pepsi that was as close as I could come to coffee, so it did its job. And out you went back onto the river, and man, that was magical. And it was also eye-opening because I came upon some lights maybe an hour later that were kind of going this way and that way, and I'm thinking, I got a pretty decent night's sleep. It's not a hallucinating kind of moment. I should have my senses about me. And I came up on the guy that was in first place skiing, and he'd passed me. And I was only down 3 hours. And he was behind 2 dudes that were walking and running, and they'd passed me. And it just blew me away. I was so impressed, and most of my ego not really affected, but a bit of it was, but not much. And come to find out that the one dude that was ahead at that moment had won numerous 100-mile races, and he'd been jogging most of those 60 miles, hadn't slept yet, and had a 30-pound sled behind him attached to his body with everything on it that you have to survive, which is what you see here. That is the exact bike with the exact stuff that I took on there. And well, there's not the 2 family-sized bags of peanut M&Ms, but there are still a couple of M&Ms in there I should probably get rid of. But so without the food, that's it. And so incredibly impressive people on the trail, and it's pitch dark, and it's just you and the snow and the occasional wood lath that is stuck in the ice and snow that's there until it thaws, that shows you the way, and the trail is laid in. And we had a lot of snow this year. It was unseasonably warm by Alaska standards, and if you were fat biking, the last thing you want is warm temperatures, because that brings snow, and snow means slow. Another great lesson of Alaska and this trail is acceptance. You can't beat Alaska, so what it hands you, you better just say thank you and be on your way, because you only have so many matchsticks up here to take on any great adventure. And every time you rage against the machine, you burn them. And when those matchsticks go out, there aren't any more. And so I turned my music up good and loud and continued on down the trail to Nancy's place, which is just off the trail to the left at mile 73. And she's just this wonderful lady who lives in a house that Alaska is slowly eating. Literally. You can see the house is sinking. It's not a house, it's a cabin, and it's sinking into the tundra on the side of here. But this lady just opens up her house for the racers to cook you anything you want. And she had every kind of cake you could imagine. She had so many kinds of cake that by the time she reached the last piece of cake that she could offer me, I forgot what the first 3 pieces of cake were, because there were that many of them, and cookies and everything you could imagine, and eggs, and that's just what she does. And most people raced by there, but there was no way I was going to soak up everything that this trail had to offer. And it almost cost me, because she put me in a food coma, and she had little cabins right behind that you could rent. And you've got 10 days to do the 350 miles. So it was probably one of my most challenging moments to not go back there and catch some Z's in her cabin after she fed me so much food. Checkpoints, if you have ever raced, are dangerous places. They can be really great, but stay too long and they'll end your race. The next day I was just on fire. There was that day, as it continued on, I just settled into this incredible pace, not from a quickness standpoint, but just from a being in the elements, being one with the trail, the event, the landscape. Time just was doing what it does in these events. It starts to disappear, and you're just in it. You're just in it. Time doesn't matter anymore. It doesn't. It's not even that it doesn't matter. It stops existing, because it's just about the work that you're doing at the time. And the next roadhouse was at 110 miles, and great food again, but I was still fat from the feed that I'd had 4 hours earlier. I busted right through there, and at that point you start to transition. One great thing about this course is it gives you all of Alaska. So you start leaving from this bar outside of Anchorage, and then you slowly start to work into the foothill regions, and then you're going to get into the mountains, and you're going to go over the mountains, and then eventually you get into just this tundra, this wide open, mind-numbing, horrible place that I'll hopefully not cuss like I did when I was there. They joked about this region causing numerous documented cases of trail Tourette's. And I was one. And so you get to see it all. And so eventually, leaving there, you get into this area where you're starting to you can see in the distance that there's hills. And by this point, unless you're trying to ride or walk with somebody, you ain't seeing nobody. You're dancing with Alaska. And for me, that was fantastic. I go to these places because I want to find out who this is. And although it's great to spend time with people on the trail, you're not going to have to always deal with you. And at this point in the race, I was getting to do that. I was getting to spend time with the person that most of the time I really like. And I really like him when he's in these places. And so we were in our element, and you could see forever. It just, I wish I was good enough with the words that I could paint the picture to you so you could see what that place is. But even if I went on for hours, if we sat you there right now, you would look at me and be like, you did a really bad job of describing this place. It's that big, it's that vast, it's that, even after 4 months, I would put my foot down and be like, I see you, but I don't understand you. I can't grasp you, I can't get it. I remember seeing the Grand Canyon and thinking the same thing, and this place makes the Grand Canyon look like it's a little ditch. And I can't believe I'm saying that because I've seen that and I know what it did to me, but this place just was like, if I go 10 feet that way, I'll be the first human to ever stand there. It's that kind of place. And I was looking right at it, like, that's where we're going. I don't know where that is, but that's where we're going. And it was that sort of day, just magnificent. And the sun started to set, and it was the second day, and I was 10 miles from getting to a mile 130, which is where a box with really cool messages that I sent to me 10 days before was waiting with all kinds of food, really good food. The kind of food that you normally wouldn't eat in everyday life, but when you're pedaling in the middle of Alaska, you can't wait. Salami and cheese and pot pies and every kind of baked good I could stuff in. You would be amazed how much you can stick into a box given 7 pounds. And there was 20 pounds of food in a 7-pound box. And life could not be any better, but Alaska has this way of saying, all right, you passed the test. Pat, pat, pat. And at least with me, at the moment that the sun went down and the northern lights came out, I was like, I am the man. I am all over this place. I have been riding for 12, 14 hours today. The northern lights are coming out. This place is fantastic. How could this be any better? I felt a little breeze in my face. And then all of a sudden the northern lights went away. And 5 minutes later, if I yelled at the top of my lungs right now where you're sitting, you wouldn't be able to hear me. If I put my hand in front of my face, I couldn't see it. And I was scared to death. There was no going back. There was only going forward. And there was nothing that I could do about it. If I stopped, I was in the wide open, I would die. If I took one step too far to the left, because I couldn't see the trail anymore, I'd fall into soft snow up to my hip. And I'd have to throw my bike, which without all the food on it is probably 50 pounds, but with all the food on it and everything else, including the water bottles being full, it was probably 75 pounds. So I'd push it off of me after the third or fourth time calling it bad names. And I'd dig myself out of a snowbank, which is not an easy thing to do. And I'd look down at the line on my GPS, hoping that I was on the trail, but the only way you would know you were on the trail is if you didn't fall. And occasionally the wind would die down to 30 or 40 miles an hour and you'd throw your leg over your bike and you'd start to pedal. And it was almost like Alaska was just doing it to play with you. Because you'd get on the bike and then a breeze would grab you and it would just knock you over. And so you just stop doing that. Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me 7 times. All right, I'll stay off the bike. And I saw through a break in the wind a taillight 100 yards ahead of me, and with everything I had, scared to death, I call it running. I was not moving much faster than a really fast walk, but I was running. It was just the wind was blowing that hard into me. That's as fast as I could, because I needed to be with somebody. I was scared for my life. For the first time, really, there was no control. And had I been in the woods, no big deal. I'd been out of the wind, I'd have taken my gear out, and I'd have just been like, that's it. Like, I know who's boss here. I'm gonna hunker down, and when it blows over, but there was none of that. We were in the wide open, and I eventually caught up to a guy from Germany and scared the hell out of him because he couldn't see behind him by the time I got there. And, hey! And I'm sure he was scared enough, although I come to find out he had done the race before, and thank God he had, because I said, dude, when we hit those woods that I can see ahead of me, I'm done. I'm not pushing through this anymore, man. I am scared to death. I've been calling for my mom. Like, I need to stop. And he's like, and I knew we were close, but it was just such an inhospitable place. And so, but he was like, no, dude, it's just there. And it took us 2 hours to go 2 miles. But we got there. And our welcome was a wall tent with 12 other really tired, snoring men and women that had just come through what I came through, and were hunkered in there, and it didn't smell particularly good. But we were out of the wind, and we had our salami and cheese, and we had all of those things. And so that was the first big story of that race for me. It was to experience being completely out of control of the elements. So we got up at 5, 6 in the morning, and the wind had subsided, and we were actually now getting into an area of the race which eventually turns into a place called the Happy Steps, the stupidest, most poorly named place in the world. A place where you would at times be so steep that you would push that bike like that, and you would lock the brakes, and then that would be the way that you would pull yourself up, and then you'd push it again, and it wasn't happy. But that's called the Happy Steps. But that morning, for some reason, I just had nothing, and I left with the guy from Germany and Jill Martinsdale. We met on the Arrowhead Trail years ago, and she's 5'2" and just a destroyer. I mean, she slaughters the trail with happiness. She just never stops joking and smiling. She's just amazing. And we were all riding together, and they just slowly were starting to pull away for no good reason. And I just didn't have much. And the sun, before it was starting to come up, they'd gotten away from me, and I wasn't going to chase them because it's just too long a race to try to do anybody else's race. And so I had a decision to make. I could either do my work, or I could spend the whole day being pissed and just fight through this lack of energy. And so I took what was starting to become a really miserable morning, and I just decided I'm going to find a place to lay down. And I looked for a safe place. The trail's only 6 foot wide, and so you can't just bivvy on the trail. And when I say bivvy, that's just taking your stuff and laying it out and getting in it and going to sleep. And I needed an attitude adjustment. And so I found a place just trail right where there was a don't go this way marker, and it was just light enough that I laid my sleeping bag out, and it was just doing the work. It was doing everything that I had practiced and doing it in the right steps, because it's 15 below. So if you make a mistake, your hands or your feet or whatever it is get really cold, and sometimes cold, dangerously cold. Those people I told you about that got in trouble on the trail late, their hands got so cold that they couldn't zip up their parka because their hands wouldn't work. And if you can't zip up, you get the picture. It's a bad situation. So step by step by step, I laid those things out, and I laid my sleeping bag out, and then I poured the hot water into my freeze-dried meal, and I let that sit there so that my breakfast would be cooking while I laid my stuff out. So you learn to multitask, and you do these things in the right step. And as I sat down in my sleeping bag and put my legs in there with my boots and everything on, I'm looking straight across the valley, and I can see the glow coming up behind the mountains, and I have the best bedroom than any person on this planet has ever had. And I know when I wake up 90 minutes from now that I am going to have a view that just few have ever been able to imagine. And so I opened up my freeze-dried meal, and I ate my chicken and dumplings, and yes, it is delicious for breakfast at 5 o'clock in the morning when you haven't eaten for a while and you're on the trail and you're looking at the mountains and you're in this place that you've dreamed of your whole life. And I fell asleep, and I Woke back up in 90 minutes because that was another thing that we talked about. That's a good, nice amount of sleep. And I was a new man, and I had this view of the sun now coming over the mountains. And it was the payoff for doing my one thing. But it was also the payoff for doing my work and putting myself in a position where I didn't dread taking that bivvy. You know, so often people show up to these events with all of this gear and it still has the price tags on it. People at Arrowhead this year, a third of that race got frostbite. Not because they didn't have the gear, but because they wouldn't use it. They just kept going. The exact same situation, two people see it completely differently and handle it differently. And the rest of that day was phenomenal. I was by myself, but I'd done my work and I was getting paid off for it. I was in the hills, the happy steps. They weren't happy, but man, it had all my attention and it had all my energy, and I was completely immersed and so thankful to be in a place where I had to push my bike over my head and set my brakes to take 2 steps to catch up to it. Even in Boonville, you can't do that. Maybe on the B roads if it's really muddy. And then I got to Rainy Pass Lodge. Rainy Pass is the crux of the race. And I'm doing my very best to put 5 days and 6 hours and 350 miles into the hour we have together. So I'm skipping some really cool stuff, but I'm going to give you the highlights. And Rainy Pass is the place that the old timers told me, because I had talked to all of them and I had studied as much as I could because this race scared the hell out of me. And they said, if you do one thing or don't do one thing, do not go over Rainy Pass at night in a storm. And you could tell they meant it. And I got to Rainy Pass 2 hours behind Jill Martinsdale, and I pulled into the hunter's cabin. But before that, I crossed this lake and I looked over, and the music was blasting in my ears and no one else was around. And I got to this thing at least 2 hours quicker than I thought I had, because it had just been that kind of magical descent off of this mountain going down the hill. I may have hooted and hollered, and it was just amazing. And I cried in my goggles because I just was overwhelmed. And I got in the cabin and I had the best glass of hot Tang. And so that does age me. But I didn't even know that stuff existed anymore. And there it was, these big, and maybe it doesn't. Maybe it's just an Alaska thing and they bought 20 cases of it in 1987 and it's still left over. But it was delicious. And I was 2 hours behind Jill Martinsdale. And not that I was doing her race, but I really wanted to catch her, because we've just always kind of been around each other. So I left Rainy Pass Lodge after eating some really good soup. They have this giant black kettle, and they just leave soup in this boiling hot kettle over a wood stove. And you have to guess what the soup is, because most of the cans have been in there so long that the labels have just floated off. So you might get chili. At that point, believe me, you don't care. Any soup is good soup. And I left there and the sun was still mostly shining, and I got 3 miles away from the lodge. And just like that, darkness started to come, not because the day was ending, because there was still plenty of daylight, and the snow started to come. And I knew I still had 15 miles to get to that pass. And I'd seen this before. I'd been in it just a night before. I knew what this storm could produce, and that was at sea level. I was about to be above tree line, where I would be the freshest bait for Mother Nature to take a bite out of. And this was the first test. This was the first test where it said, I can feel your ego. I know you want to go. And I took 10 steps forward, and the voices, I could hear them. I could hear the old timer say, don't do it, dude. And I'd say, okay. And I turned around. And I went 10 steps, and my ego said, you can do it, dude. And I turned around and I headed back up the pass, and I went 10 steps. Don't do it, dude. And I'm not joking, I did it 6 times. And then I stood there and I turned around. I woke up the next morning and the sun was out. The storm was still raging, but the sun was out. It wasn't snowing, but the sun was out. I could see, and the wind was blowing, and it was incredible. And I was still enough in tree line that I headed up on my way, came out of tree line for the first time, and I had another one of those cry into your goggle moments. And it was just this place to look around and see, and no one else is around, and I could feel my grandparents. I could feel those people that had always supported me, and I knew they could see me. And I just looked around so that they could see what I could see. And I wanted to stay there forever, but the wind blew so hard it knocked me over and I fell over my bicycle. And so I carried on, and I was just close to what I thought was tree line. And I went through another section of the woods, and then I came completely out of tree line, and the wind was absolutely howling. The video you saw was from a guy named Kyle Durand and Adam Eritzo that had headed up that mountain about an hour ahead of me. I was, if you could have zoomed in far enough, you probably could have seen me just a couple miles behind them, pushing into that storm. And they call them ground blizzards because there's no real storm, but it whips up what wind and what snow is on the ground, and you can see it coming at you. It was constant, what you saw there. It was 15 degrees below zero, and the wind was steady at 50 miles an hour. Puts the wind chill somewhere about 40 below. But occasionally, you'd see Mother Nature take a little deeper breath, and you could see the snow rolling off of the mountains, and you'd have to lean into it, or it would knock you over. And Rainy Pass became a fist fight. It started out, you got my attention, I hear you. Every 10 steps, I'd have to turn my back to the wind and pull my face mask down because it was such an effort. I was running out of breath and I couldn't get enough oxygen through my face mask. So I turned my back to the wind and I pulled my face mask down so I could breathe. Take as many deep breaths as I could, and I'd face back into it and I'd push until I'd have to do that again. But eventually it became a fist fight. Eventually it became Mother Nature saying, this is it. This is where you prove to me how much you want it. This is where you prove to me that you're worthy of the prize. And all of you chasing that one thing in your phone, you're going to get to that moment. If it's big enough, you're going to get to that moment, and something's going to come up, and you're going to have to prove to that thing that you really want it. And sometimes it turns into a fist fight. And that became my moment. That became my moment where I took one step, and I told Mother Nature that I'm not going to stop. You blow as hard as you want. For every time you can blow and blow harder, I got one more step for you. And I'll take another step, and I'll take another step, and I'll take another step until I get to that opening and I'm out of this wind. But you're not going to stop me. And that's when I really believed that it was there as that loving parent. It was there to say, this is the test. I'm not bending my rules. But if you get through there, you're going to be a better person for it. And I got through that pass, and the wind stopped. Didn't stop, I was just out of it. And then that was replaced by snow that was about 2 foot deep. And I had 5 more miles to go up that pass, post-holing the entire way, pushing that bike. And occasionally, you'd get off that 2 foot pack stuff, and the bike would just slowly take a right turn. It's like it would just, bad bike. Bad bike. And you pick it up and you put it back and you'd be like, if you saw it, you would swear the person is crazy. You're talking, you're screaming, you're arguing with your bike. But it was that sort of thing. And at the top of the pass, I was so pissed because the storm was so gnarly, I couldn't take my picture by the Rainy Pass sign. the sign that I'd looked at so long. It was like one last slap to my ego to be like, no, you don't get to show anybody you were here. You can go now. There was no screaming crowds. There was no chance for a picture to send. But I did have my satellite phone. And we were giving updates, and I was able to get on that phone and say, we did it. And it was always we. It was always, I know there's people in this room that were watching that blue dot. And you chasing your one thing, you'll have people that are watching your blue dot. And when you don't have anything left, or don't think you have anything left in yourself, I would reach through that tracker, and I would hold on to those people watching my blue dot. They got me there, and it was always we. And I came down the other side of that pass, and it was the most magnificent trail. It was packed, and you were just flying down into the next checkpoint. And I was in this perfect place. I didn't catch Jill. I never did catch Jill. But I was in this perfect place where the really fast people were gone, and the people that were slower, that had got caught in that storm, they were a day behind. So it was just me and one other dude that got to stay in the wall tent and sleep on the 6 foot long by 4 foot wide, 3 foot tall stack of pine boughs. I'd never slept on a bed of pine boughs. It was freaking great. And it was just another one of those moments where you're like, really? I'm in the middle of Alaska and I'm sleeping on pine boughs in a wall tent in the middle of nowhere? And this wonderful volunteer is cooking me as many bratwursts as I'll eat? I ate a lot of them. And I slept there until 6 in the morning, and I got on the bike, and everything was perfect. And we rolled out, and Adrian, who looks like Thor, he was one of the volunteers. I'll admit it, I have a bit of a man crush on him. He was like 6'6" and had this curly, long blonde hair. And he was just, you'd show up and it didn't matter how cold you were. He'd give you this hug and you were suddenly warm from the top of it. It was amazing. And we were pulling it out of camp, and he said, and he'd been all over this place. Like, he lives there. Not lives there, but he's there all the time. He's like, you got it made. The next 70 miles, the trail will be perfect. I'm like, no, you did not say that. You did not say that. And this is a trail. It's called the Farewell Burn. It's thousands and thousands of acres that have burnt, and there's nothing there, and it's notoriously cold, and it was 20 degrees below zero. And that seems really cold, but it really isn't. When you're prepared and you've done your work and you've got your gear and you've got everything on that bike, you know you're okay, and you just put on your 20 below gear and you go biking. And the trail was fantastic at the start, and that frozen picture you saw was a section of the river that was completely windswept, and you were biking with your studded tires down this frozen river, and you can see into it, and occasionally it creaks, and when it does, your body does weird things. Things pucker that normally, I mean, it's a crazy, but it didn't break, and we kept on, and 40 miles down that trail, we're making, I say we because there was 8 voices in my head, it's always we, and there was a hunter's cabin off to the side where you could stop, but you're trying to get to Nikolai, and if you get to Nikolai, you're 1 day away. You're 50 miles from McGrath, which is going to be my finish line. And you're thinking, again, I'm home free. Like, I got 30 miles to go. I don't need to stop at the hunter's cabin because we're killing it. And so I keep on, and I'm not listening to music at that point because there was a different music playing that I was really enjoying. And I could hear the whir of snowmobile engines. And I'm thinking, please, don't be coming this way. But where else could they be going? It's the Iditarod Trail. There's only one trail. But you're trying to think of any different. And the trail was way above average to that point, but we'd had a lot of snow, so it wasn't the normal Iditarod Trail, which has been sled dog packed down for 3 months, and it's like snow cement. And 4 snowmobiles come by me, and they turn the trail to white sand. And I'd been going 6 miles an hour, which, believe me, based on some of the places we'd had to push our bike, 6 was a Ferrari. And they went past us, and you could let out all the air in your tires you wanted to. You couldn't keep the bike upright. And so the push began, and it was in one of those sections like the Coming Trail I was talking about. You were pushing your bike and you could see everything in front of you. It was straight as far as you could see to the horizon. And there was no getting away from the fact that you were realizing you were going to have to walk as far as you could see in white sand that came up to your shins. And the snow on both sides was a little bit higher. And I still don't understand what that is so appealing to that bike, but it likes to go that way. And then it gets stuck and you have to pick it up and put it back in. And slowly but surely, it's starting to eat away at me. And we eventually enter into this swampland, and you would come into the woods, and then you'd go into a swamp, and then you'd go into the woods, and you'd go into the swamp. Well, when you went into the woods, that's sheltered from the wind, and it would be packed, and not even the snowmobiles unpack that. But every animal that calls Alaska home was walking on that trail, and had made these perfectly wonderful ruts. And moose are big, and they put divots in the trail this deep. And so, this time of year, you drive your car down a road and you hit a pothole. What it does. Well, imagine that road having 20 of them, and you can't avoid them. And they go on for 10 miles. And it's the only road that you get to drive your car on to get where you're going. You can't go any other way. So you go 3. But 3 sucks because you're still going. And then your payoff is when you get done with that road, you have to get out and you have to walk across the swamp because now the snow is soft. And this is where the trail Tourette's set in. And at the end of the race, the first call I made was to my mother. And I apologized to her for how her son reacted that night, because she would have disowned me. The trail in Alaska once again said, you thought Rainy Pass was a challenge, and you passed it. But now you're going to have to show me one more time before the finish of this race how bad you want it. And it got to the point where the only joy I had in my life was when I would get across one of those swamps, I would turn around and I would flip off the swamp. And I would cuss at it and call it names and say, take that. You didn't stop me. And then when I would get back on my bike to go through the woods, I started insulting the trail, telling it it's not really a trail at all. I've been on trails. You're not a trail. You're a poor excuse for a trail. Look at you. You got holes in you. You don't let nobody can ride you. I don't even know why they call you a trail. I'll never come back here. I completely lost everything. I've never been so empty in my entire life. I think I figured by the time I got to the checkpoint at 300 miles, 75 miles for that day, the last 30 miles took me 10 hours. 1 mile outside of town, there was a sign, and I call it a town, it was a village. And these villages are, as you can imagine, people live there because they want to live a life of subsistence. They're not the kind of place where you go grab a mocha in the morning. It's not that sort of place. But there was a sign coming out of the woods, and it said, Nikolai, 1 mile. And I said, good try. I don't think that's funny. I don't know who put that sign there, but I know it's not 1 mile because this trail never ends. This is a death march to nowhere. because I'd gotten so far, so deep in the hole, I could no longer allow myself hope. Because if that was untrue, in the state I was in, I was going to lay down, curl up in a ball, and they would either find me froze to death, or they would find me and put me on a sled and they would take me the rest of the way. I had to believe that it was a lie. And a half mile from there was a sign that said, Nikolai, a half mile. And I said, that's still not funny. I don't believe you. And I pushed my bike up to the sign that said, bikes, sleds, worries, with a thing right there, still muttering to myself, half mile, half mile, half mile. And not until I went inside and the Aussie dude that was there volunteering slapped 2 cheeseburgers in front of my face was I able to allow myself that I'd made it to Nikolai. And the 3 dudes that were in there that had just come off that trail the last 3 hours before said, how was that, bro? And I didn't think it was funny. But I ate all my cheeseburgers and I drank 3 or 4 Cokes, and about that time, 2 walkers came in and they looked just like me. And I said, how was that, bro? And that kind of camaraderie I miss so dearly. To be in that place. And the next day I spent with Kyle and Adam. Adam was the one holding the camera while Kyle pushed his bike across Ptarmigan Valley that you saw. And we spent the most incredible day together. There's a camaraderie, there is an honesty, there is a shared bond when you go on these adventures. When you chase your one thing, you're going to form those bonds with those people that are part of your journey. And they get forged really quick. I feel like I'm closer friends with some of these people that I spent 5 days on that trail with than I am people I spent 10, 15 years growing up with. I can't explain it. I don't care to explain it. I just know there's people I grew up with. If they said, dude, I'm in a little bit of trouble, I really need you over here, I'd be like, yeah, maybe you should call someone else. But if any one of those cats rang my phone, I don't care what side of the planet they're on, I'm out of bed and I'm going. I don't know why that is the way it is, but that's it, and I miss them dearly. And we spent an incredible amount of time on that trail, and a picture pushing up the hill was part of that day. And there was no time. We put our foot down, and I had another chicken and dumplings meal that the only hot water I had was infused with Tang, and somehow that hot Tang chicken and dumplings was delicious. I think it probably had a lot to do with the environment I was eating it in and the company I was keeping. And we eventually came off that trail, and we were on this sort of plowed road by this old abandoned mine. And you knew you were getting close. And the hills kind of kept going, and I'd learned enough to not start to think any one of those hills would be the last. If the truth be told, I really didn't want there to be a last one. It was all coming to a close quicker than I wanted. And eventually I saw a light, the kind of light that is generated by electricity. And we didn't see many of those over the 6 days that we were, 5.5 days that we were out there. And now we weren't on a beat up gravel sort of road anymore, and there weren't any hills, and now there were lights kind of off the distance to your left and your right, and you realize there were cabins around. And then it was really flat, and you could see a lot of lights ahead of you. And Kyle, who had finished the 1,000-mile race the year before on foot and was attempting to do the 1,000 this year on bike, which he eventually did, rode up ahead of me, or rode up alongside of me, and he said, "That left turn, and you're 1.5 miles from the finish." And he said, "This is the place I like to reflect on everything it is that got me here." And he rode away. And that 1.5 miles, thinking back to stepping out of that jail, that 5K, all of the things that came up to that moment, wishing I had windshield wipers on the inside of my goggles. That's the thing. That's the reason why when we started here tonight, I wanted, and I hope you put down your one thing, because having the chance to experience that, all I want to do is share it. It's the reason why I ran across the state of Iowa. It's the reason why I ran around Lake Michigan. It's to hopefully lead a life that makes me cry in my goggles. It's hopefully to lead a life that makes you want to cry into your goggles, to find your one thing and to give everything that you have to that one thing. When I look out, when I have the opportunity to share these things, I see what Sir Shackleton called the pioneers of the possible. That's what I see in every one of you, because I know it's possible, because I've taken that journey. And there would be nothing that would make me happier than, over the course of the next weeks, months, and years, to be able to open up Facebook, to be able to look in the paper, to be able to see you on the streets, and to be able to hear about your cry in the goggles moment. And that is my hope, and that is my dream for every one of you here. Thanks so much for spending the time with me.